Welcome to the Sirius Report. This is obviously Paul, and we're very pleased that Dario has joined us again today. I'm sure many of you know who Dario is. You can obviously, we'll put his contact details in the description below, so you can get in touch with him there. So Dario, thank you very much for joining us again. And what would you like to talk about today?
Very happy to be here again today. It's so exciting. And today I believe it will be very interesting topic that really deserves attention right now, and that, frankly speaking, is not very well covered as they all things that need a lot of attention, but sometimes it might spoil some beans somewhere. Is what's happening in the semiconductor sectors, and in particular in the last 3 months there have been some significant development that might well be of great impact to markets overall in the coming weeks and months.
Yeah, sure. I'm in complete agreement with you. I think it's something that's largely goes under the radar. There's some broad understanding of things, and particularly in relation to the US sort of policy decisions with regards to China and semiconductors. But aside from that, there isn't an awful lot of interest or understanding in people talking about this, but it's an extremely important subject for very obvious reasons, given, I talk about energy being the lifeblood of a nation. Well, semiconductors are the lifeblood of everything, electronic, effectively. So it's an extremely interesting and important subject, and it does have not just industrial implications, but there's broader economic, financial considerations that in these situations are not understood or get completely overlooked.
Yeah, that's totally the case.
So where would you like to start with this then?
No, where I would like to start and right away is basically what's happening right now, and that is being broadly ignored, is that effectively there is the glut on many like semiconductor components that for the past months were in such a high demand, apparently, is materializing. And there have been so many key piece of elements and red flags that started as as early as October that have been quickly dismissed, but in reality these red flags right now are piling up. And not only the glut is related to the components themselves, but what is already starting to materialize and to trickle in in the narratives and also in the comments of many high-profile figures is that the whole hype that was around this whole AI narrative, that I will still insist what we have seen right now has nothing to do with AI, simply because there are no real AI businesses out there, and applications being developed and accessible and available to be purchased in the form of shares in the market. Very similar to what happened at the beginning of and during the hype of the dot-com bubble. So if you think about it, a lot of the companies that became the Mag 7 today actually came in the aftermath of the dot-com bubble. So I would like to make a brief intro to set the mindset for everyone. So into the AI business, there are effectively three components, okay? And these three components are all necessary at the same time. Otherwise, the business cannot stand, okay? These three components. One, of course, is the computing power, okay? But other two components that didn't get much attention so far are actually the power, the electricity to run like data centers. And the last component that maybe is the most important of all is the data themselves, the data available to train AI model and improve them to make them more and more useful, more and more accurate and effective, okay? So one thing I want to flag about the data is that a few days ago, in a speech that didn't really make many headlines out there, one of the co-founders of OpenAI, Ilya Sutskever, that was actually one of the three members that created the very famous paper in 2012, basically like highlighting how the use of GPU could effectively speed up the development of AI, because GPUs that till that time were used for graphics, for video games, in reality allowed for parallel computations at the same time, while CPUs didn't. So it takes much longer time to train a complicated model using CPUs. So what he said is that effectively the current AI models might have hit a ceiling, because there is that much public information available on the internet that can be used to train these models, right? So, and this is a very important element, because the amount of data these models need to be trained on in order to have marginal improvement, it becomes effectively larger and larger the more the model grows. And if the data available cannot keep the same pace of growth, effectively you hit a ceiling that you cannot go beyond, but effectively like you will be constrained to the growth of the public and accessible information available. And as an example, I'd like to share what effectively happened with OpenAI. OpenAI is one of those, it's been the first mover to a certain extent in the space, and as many like acute observers realized, the very first model of ChatGPT were paradoxically better than the releases that came after. And why? Because the model was trained even on information that in theory they were not supposed to be using, because they were protected by copyright law. And once they removed that information from the data set, the following releases that have been published on ChatGPT were actually worse than rather than being better, exactly because of the importance of this data. And here it comes the big advantage of the likes of Google, Facebook, and Twitter X on this front, because like all these players, they have access to a much larger amount of data that is not really publicly available on the internet, right? These data are the social media data, and these social media data are not just the post, the videos or the comment they put out there, but in reality, there are more data beyond that in terms of like user data, interaction data, connection data, and behavioral data among users, so on and so forth. And effectively, if you think about it, this is the reason why, like, the latest releases of the products from these companies are objectively like much better than what OpenAI could deliver, right? So here is the key of the importance of data. The other element I want to highlight is the power, okay? So to run GPU data centers is actually incredibly power consuming, okay? And effectively, like, GPUs is a technology that was not meant to be for AI. The name for GPU stands for graphic processing unit, okay? So effectively, there's been a technology repurposed for AI, okay? But with this came a lot of inefficiencies that like hinder the profitability of the business themselves. So, and if you check, I checked myself, but if you check the electricity consumption data around the location of many of the AI data centers that have been disclosed, paradoxically speaking, you don't see a significant pickup of electricity usage, to the point that it almost makes you wonder whether all these like hundreds of thousands of GPUs that have been purchased and put online, in theory, are effectively online. And furthermore, you can actually see that Facebook and even Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft, have been quite upfront about this and about the availability of cheap electricity in order to run all these operations with business effective costs. And Facebook just issued an RFP for access to nuclear generated electricity. Satya Nadella came out the past weekend in an interview saying, I don't see like semiconductor shortage tightness anymore, but we might have a power supply issue. So, and here, saying this, I want to go back to the third element, that is semiconductors themselves. So here we already saw that on two critical elements of the structure, right now, the ceiling might have been already hit, or we're kind of like very close to hitting that, broadly speaking. But then it comes into semiconductors, right? On the third element, so what Satya Nadella said this past weekend was the ultimate red flag on something that in reality has been, trickling through, the closed doors of, all these like corporate offices into like blogs and sometimes into some mainstream media articles. And that started in October in an event that was incredibly important, but many dismissed. In October, ASML, that is the biggest manufacturer of machinery to make semiconductors, in particular GPUs, by mistake, released their financials 24 hours in advance. And in doing so, in those financials, it surfaced that the company had a significant slowdown in orders for their machinery, and that of course impact the ASML price a lot, but was quickly dismissed. Okay, while in reality that should have been like people should have paid attention to that, because effectively all this great narrative has been constantly built on this massive demand for computing power, right? Like ever growing demand, exponential increase. People like needed to break the rule of physics in order to deliver the instrument in order to make AI grow at a rate that has never been seen before for other like software and computing application throughout, like all the history of computing, effectively, right? So there was this slowdown in orders that, and then like a few weeks later, there was a timely announcement in order to keep everyone to give everyone a little bit of relief. And there was this announcement that ASML and TSMC agreed on a significant order for future machinery. Okay, and that honestly was a bit strange, because if you look into TSMC capacity, it's actually not running at 100%. It's running between 75 and 80%. So, they still have quite a bit of room on that front, with machines that are already capable to produce the technology that they have been ordered to already. And then, several weeks later, I'm not going to touch upon SMCI because I talked about that a lot, and frankly is quite exhausting. But there was another interesting thing that happened. Is like, despite Dell PR machine was very active in showcasing their progresses in creating like more advanced server racks to run GPUs and whatnot, when they released their financials, it actually came out that they didn't have that much demand as people expected to. So there was a slowdown. And then Oracle, another company, came, and it actually flagged the same type of trend. And then this escalated in like, a few days ago with Satya Nadella that said like publicly, we don't see semiconductor like tightness in the market anymore. And here I want to conclude on this section highlighting what only appeared in some very specialized technological blogs and media on the internet, that analysts like that are paying a lot of attention to the dynamic, to the industrial dynamic of the semiconductor market, not to the stocks or whatever. They actually flagged that looking at the production rate and the latest like a hiccup on and faultiness on the NVIDIA black GPUs and whatnot, it actually flagged that everything is pointing towards the like of Microsoft having canceled 40% of its order. I mean, that's a massive amount. It's something that it deserves more investigation for sure, more visibility, but eventually is yet another signal of this massive glut in the semiconductor industry that is appearing even in places where it shouldn't be. Because honestly, if you go to Amazon, if you go to eBay, if you go to Alibaba and whatever, you can buy the very latest GPUs and semiconductor that not long ago were commercialized as impossible like to get your hands on, while now like they are available at 20, 30, sometimes even a 40% discount on this platform. And that it's a quite big difference to the narrative that has been pushed non-stop since years now, and many times, frankly speaking, against logic.
Yeah, sure. I mean, yeah, the evidence proves precisely what you're saying, and I think with regards to, and I have to be careful how I phrase this, but we know there's been a big move to push China out of Western markets, basically to sanction them. So they didn't have access. The US thought they could cause immense damage to China, and they've actually found, to the contrary, that China's coping remarkably well with those restrictions. Okay, it doesn't have the highest end of technology, but it's able to produce an awful lot of what it needs for its domestic consumption in terms of semiconductor chips, and the advancements it's making are rapid. And you have to start to wonder if China's consuming some of the market that previously Western companies had, I wouldn't say had dominated those markets, but had a huge lion's share of it. I'm not saying that's completely the answer, because I don't think it is by any stretch of the imagination, but I suspect that's part of the problem. And I also think for the likes of ASML, they're world leaders, for example, in lithography by a mile and further. And of course, because of the constraints that the United States effectively forced upon them to place with regards to orders from China, that's going to impact their business. And also the worrying thing in the future, not at this precise moment in time, is China's now trying to, excuse me, develop its own lithography machines. And the risk is eventually they will develop something that's a competitor to ASML, and they may start to impact their business line. And I think companies like that are very mindful of the risk that poses to them. And this is suffering the consequences of US policy decisions, which impacts businesses who have been dominant players in the market because they produce superb technology. But if you hand an initiative to China, the risk is eventually they will produce the same products, but they might produce it cheaper. And therefore that then starts to impact Western businesses. So I'm not suggesting that's the sole reason. It's probably a small part of the reason, but certainly it seems to be indicative of part of this kind of, well, global Western slowdown in economies, etc., and why there isn't the demand that there was. Okay, some of it's absolutely right. Has been exaggerated, but I think in general there is a slowdown, and this is another indication of that.
Yeah, you're totally correct. But there is one element I'd like to highlight, and quite interesting. There was an interesting chart on the FTS that was showing the capex spending on GPUs and computing infrastructure and data center by major companies, where Microsoft was, of course, the number one by far. It has been for several years, but in reality, at the top of that list, you also had several famous Chinese companies, right? And it was quite funny to see the comments of people, like seeing the chart or whatever, and they were like, "How is possible that TikTok got hold of that many GPUs, right?" So let me be frank with you. I believe that whoever wanted GPUs, okay, got them. And there are, if you go in the financial statements on several companies, okay, let's take the example of NVIDIA. NVIDIA, 50% of the market, roughly speaking, or so, is US, okay? But then 50% of the market, pretty much 50%, like maybe 45 or whatever, is China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Singapore. I mean, in Taiwan, if you check the billions of GPUs they claim to have sold there, it accounts for in 1 quarter. It accounts for decades of local demand in Taiwan. So clearly, it's impossible that those GPUs stayed there. And Singapore is the same, right? So I don't want to, there are no elements to, to prove that those GPUs went to, to China. And frankly, even if they went, personally speaking, I am for a free market, free beat. All the, free markets are good for economies, are good for people. And frankly, like where there is, it's all matters of demand and supply, right? So you see this FT chart, you see this data for in the financial statements like the one I just shared, right? And then you wonder, like how much demand there is still out there, because there are not that many companies that can build and run data centers, right? So, but then you said correctly, there is a very big issues. Like these semiconductors were incredibly expensive, mostly because there were like 2 or 3 companies like making them. So, and you had all these like giant conglomerates that were trying to outbid each other to get their hands as fast as possible on this computing power in order to gain a competitive advantage that in reality it wasn't the case. Because if, for example, Microsoft and OpenAI were the very first movers in the game, and Microsoft bought so many semiconductors, how come that now there are far better products in the market released by the likes of Twitter, X, Google, and Facebook, right? And if you check the number of GPUs that they purchased, the number is far inferior than what Microsoft did. And so, and to conclude here, you're right, like these things were massively expensive. And now, like the likes of, Microsoft and other companies, they figured that they might have mistakenly calculated the potential profitability of the very first stage of product releases in the market. Like how much money you can make if all these tools available out there are now pretty much available for free, or like very minimal like price tags. Like Grok just announced is Grok number 2 is going to be free. Then the Facebook one is a free access. The Google one is free access. So, I mean, clearly, like, there is going to be, is happening exactly the same that happened at the very beginning of the dot-com bubble. There has been this massive build-up of semiconductor, and then people quickly figured that these operations with those costs were not profitable. But then the internet happened to scale up and thrive in the aftermath of the dot-com bubble, exactly because the computing power, because of that glut, became so cheap that you could build profitable operation. And on this front, as you said, I totally agree with you. Like, as usual, like China is gonna, jump ahead of the pack, as they always do. Like they did it with Chinese car now, like way more advanced than what is being manufactured in Europe or US, like objectively speaking, and at much cheaper cost. They did this in various other industries and areas, and I grant you they will do this again in semiconductor, because they have an infrastructure, they have a supply chain, and the cost of labor in order to achieve these goals. While, every time I see people, these announcements of, going to create like a semiconductor factory in Germany, in US, and whatever. Like, just do the math. Those factories can only run with a commercial viable product if they're subsidized, because the cost of labor is too high, the cost of electricity is too high, the cost of transportation is too high, and so on. So they're going to be money-losing operations. To supply a market that, as a matter of fact, is already, I wouldn't say saturated, but is shifting from what has been the massive build-up at the beginning to what is a more organic growth and improvement and maintenance in the future years.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a hugely important consideration. I want to get into the subject of reindustrializing the US, but it's a classic example of the kind of problems Western countries are going to experience. What I would add is there's no doubt China is very adept at getting around the issue of tariffs and sanctions. Like for tariffs, for example, what they did is they moved some business operations to Vietnam. And then the products were still Chinese, but they ended up, say, made in Vietnam, and then they shipped them to the United States. They've also utilized Mexico in this regard. I would suspect with regards to the issue of chips, there are probably entities, we don't know who they are, who have been taking orders for chips and then shipping them on to China as a third-party arrangement. I think that's likely. So there are those things to factor into our thinking as well with regards to sometimes not being able to account for some of the apparent discrepancies or maybe discrepancies between what we think a country would need for their own to satisfy their own requirements as opposed to the broader market. So I think that's a possibility, and China's certainly been very adept at navigating the problems that the United States has put on their shoulders. And it's, without getting to the subject of Ukraine and Russia, it's exactly the same how Russia's got around so many issues of sanctions with very clever ways of evading the problem and covering their tracks and hiding, the trade that they're conducting with countries that are in breach of, well, effectively US sanctions and, in a broader sense, Western sanctions. So I think there is that element to factor into our thinking as well.
This is totally correct, and and personally speaking, I always struggle to understand why, despite this dynamic that you described as being happening over and over again so many times, there is still like significant refrain to acknowledge and accept this dynamic and act accordingly, with pondering the consequences of them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the problem is it's the embarrassment partly to say, well, if we have to admit it, then we're saying that we put these sanctions or put these tariffs in place and they failed to deliver. So it's kind of that political embarrassment of saying, well, we'll just pretend it didn't happen, because if we have to admit it's happened, then we're admitting the failure. And then, of course, what always happens when they then try to take measures to close off one avenue, they'll just go and find another one and another one. I mean, and they're always one or two steps ahead of the likes of the United States imposing sanctions or putting tariffs on. And because the policy decisions are so woolly and they're impossible to actually implement, then it's quite easy to get around these problems. And I think that's, it's like anything. It's always, about politics, and it's about trying reputation and not wanting to be seen to be the idiot, basically, in a very crude sense. So that's largely what is the driving force behind those kind of decisions. But if at the end of the day, the world being the way it is, how interconnected we are, how easy it is to get around sanctions and tariffs, whereas historically maybe in the past that wouldn't have been the case, and it just increasingly will be that way because countries can quite easily get around the problem. And sometimes I have to say, I think the United States, well, it's been proven to be the case, that when it comes to Russia, if they want something from Russia, then sanctions don't apply. So, there is that to take into consideration as well.
As a matter of fact, what you described, like if you look at historically speaking, the only way for, let's call it sanction to be effective is when there are physical barrier. Okay. But as a matter of fact, commercial sanctions, people are, business is business. Okay. And, if you have a product and you have buyers, okay, it's pretty much in a human nature to find ways, legally speaking, to deliver this product to them and to make a profit. Okay, because people like a business to sell and to make it profitable. They're private entities that they are accountable to their shareholders. They're not accountable to countries. So unless there are physical barriers impeding them to deliver and go to a certain extent, there will always be ways around, because at the end of the day, business is business. So, and people like it or not. And if you put like tariffs of commercial restrictions on or whatnot, yeah, maybe you may have an impact at the very beginning, but the ultimate cost of this, what is effectively a form of taxation, is on the consumers, because those that are running the business, they will end up finding ways. They will be more expensive, and these higher prices always end up impacting the consumer, not the companies.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yes, that's very much the case. So, is there anything else you'd want to add to this subject? Maybe.
Well, I like to touch upon quickly before we wrap up on, the potential consequences on, companies in the sector of what I described, right? Mm-hmm. So, very quickly, everyone knows what happened in the .com. Okay, there was a big build-up of computing power, a big amount of capex, and then what happened a few years after? This capex was impaired significantly. There were like losses showing in books of companies, M&As that was done at incredibly inflated price, the goodwill has been written off like significantly, and so on. So fast forward 20 years later, the situation is not only like very similar, but has been brought to a scale that is perhaps like 100 times larger. Okay, so those that fail to recognize the shift in dynamic of what's happening, and they fail to recognize that all the value that has been priced into these companies was effectively future values embedded in, growth forecast and orders that would have like continued for years against any logic. Because if you build a data center on a specific type of technology today, you're not gonna scrap all that technology 1 year after to buy the latest release. We're not talking about phones here, okay? Even if in some cases like there are companies that the phones have not been really improving for the past like 4 to 5 years. But here we're talking about a big operation that you cannot just switch so quickly. And furthermore, like what's going to happen, like assuming you do that, what's going to happen to the money you spent, okay, on the technology that you purchase? And it's still very active for the need that you have, and then it becomes like scrap metal, right? This is not a consumer market. This is an industrial market, and there are very few companies that can bid for a certain type of product. It's not a retail market about this, and so on. So you add all this massive amount of capex, of goodwill, and potential future orders that then be piled up on financial statements, that, reasonably speaking, if this dynamic continues, as I tell you, I'm strongly convinced it's going to continue, simply because, and this is what people forgot, semiconductor industry has always been a cyclical industry that went through boom and busts. The boom are driven by advancement in technology, even if in this case there has not been much of an advancement, honestly speaking. It's been a repurpose of a technology into another use. And this technology is been already repurposed twice, because it moved from graphic and running on computers to crypto mining, even if everyone forgot. And now it moved into AI. There have been improvements, of course, along the way, but it's the very same concept. And I really believe that the real big improvement on this front is going to come when the first LPUs are gonna be released. LPUs is the learning processing unit. So chips that were designed and built on purpose for training and running large language models and heavy load AI type of application, because as I say, this is a very high computation, but you need to do it containing the cost, otherwise it is not accessible. So how many, I think overall, I believe in general, the total amount of money spent through the recent years exactly onto this direction has been roughly, I think, in the area between 800 billion and $1 trillion. Okay. So far, their revenues generated out of this capital have been, frankly, minimal. I mean, if you check the legacy companies, data center operation of the big player, still they are, the vast majority of their revenues comes from the legacy business. It's not coming from the direction they expected to, and from there this capex was meant to unlock, right? Furthermore, as I briefly mentioned before, there was this element of future orders. So all these companies have been used boldly an accounting trick, in order to value their inventories, in order to value their infrastructure, and in order to value the future demand. Okay, what is effectively like mark-to-market accounting is incredibly dangerous, and people should pay attention to. Why? Because the level of subjectivity of companies' management into this particular area of the financial statements is incredibly high. And historically speaking, this is the area of corporate financial statements that when it grew out of proportions compared to other area and became so critical to the revenue generation and to, creating a market hype for the shares and whatnot. This is exactly the area where, effectively troubles came from, right? So I don't want to go into further details, but I hope with this conversation we gave, an objective framework to people that are willing to seek more information, investigate, and better informed decision, to do it. Because when you have a market, okay, like the US market, the S&P 500, if you remove NVIDIA from the S&P 500, all the outperformance compared to the likes of the Euro stocks is gone. Okay, so you have one single company that drove an incredible market. You have all this narrative that impacted and benefit a lot of mega cap out there and created a market that is incredibly concentrated, while in reality the real business underneath all these incredible valuations that have been assigned is not really there. And the distortion created and are very dangerous, and the fact that a lot of people have been attracted to put their savings, their finances, and so on into this kind of into these companies. Perhaps they are right and they should continue, but they should pay attention, because all the elements are pointing towards 2025 that is not gonna be as honky dory as people still believe the foreseeable future will be on this front.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree. I think there's a lot of over expectation of what's going to happen. I think this is because of the Trump presidency, and the market took that as a really positive signal. I'm not going to get into that discussion, but clearly there seems to be noises already about deregulating, and Wall Street's, extremely happy about this. But from my perspective, that's fraught with danger, and people should be aware of that. But I think overall, that was a great discussion. Obviously, thank you, Dario, for joining us again today. It's
Thanks to
always
you.
a pleasure. I like your insights. I like the way you think about things, and I think it's very informative. And this sector is hugely important. And on that basis, I think hopefully people will have seen value in the discussion today. So thank you for that.
Thanks to you, and I wish you a good holidays to you, to your and to all the listeners of this podcast, and eventually talk next year.
Yes, and likewise to you and to your family. So obviously, to everyone who's listening, please like, share, subscribe, and comment. Apparently, it helps with the algorithm, so we'd be very pleased if you participate on that basis. And with that, I'll say goodbye.
Bye.